Lowry. Welcome to the Rocky Mountain Writer Podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
We look forward to finding out about more about you and your first novel, correct?
Yes, very
The,
first.
the Blue Trunk. It just came out a couple months ago, correct?
Right, September 10th.
Fantastic. Why don't we just sometimes we get to know the writer a little bit, know their background. Let's just jump right in and talk about the Blue Trunk. Tell us
Okay.
about
Well, the blue trunk was inspired by an actual blue trunk that I have. My great great aunt Marit and her sister, my great great grandmother, immigrated from Norway in the late 1800s. And so I inherited this trunk from my mother. But before I inherited it, when she had it, when my daughter was born a few decades ago now, I didn't have a name for her. So I thought, oh, I don't know, Marit's a really pretty name. So I should name, my daughter Marit. So I told my mother that. And she said, oh, no, you can't name her Marit. Marit went crazy. She was insane. And
it.
so I was like, okay, I won't name her Marit. And, years go by. But, she kind of always stuck in the back of my head because my mom had this trunk and I would see it. And then I inherited the trunk. And so I decided to start doing some genealogy research on her. And I could find a lot on my great great grandmother, but I couldn't find anything on her. I mean, literally like nothing. And I had researched the genealogy, all the popular genealogy websites. I'd gone through historical records. I went to the National Archives and find a grave, all sorts of things. And I wasn't able to find anything on her, even though I could find a lot on my great great grandmother. So I concluded that she probably did end up in an insane asylum. And so then I started researching insane asylums
Wow.
and found that frequently they weren't included in census, counted in the census, which is a way that you usually find out about people. And often they weren't even given death certificates because they were just basically became wards of the state and non-human beings. So that made me very, very sad. And then at the same time, I discovered there was a cemetery in my hometown, which I had no idea was there. And it was connected to the asylum, and it was a cemetery of the unknown, it's called the Old Orchard Cemetery. But so I suspected that perhaps she ended up there, that she lived in the asylum, she died, and was in an unknown grave because I knew she wasn't in the family plot because I knew where that was, and she wasn't there. So I thought this was really sad. So I decided to recreate her through fiction and bring her back to life, so to speak. So the Blue Trunk was born.
Wow.
Um,
So the Cemetery of the Unknown was in what town? What city?
Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Okay.
It's called Old Orchard Cemetery, but it's next to the old asylum site. And so, I grew up in that town and I had no idea it was there. And so when I went to see it, I was just really shocked. There's a nice plaque now that says that, this is the old asylum cemetery. But I was shocked at how many graves there were that said unknown on them. It broke my heart. And from a Colorado history standpoint, I discovered recently when I was doing some research that they had uncovered remains about 20 years ago, I think, in Pueblo, Colorado, from an insane asylum. Somebody was just digging for, I suppose, a subdivision or something, and they uncovered them. So it wasn't terribly uncommon that these people were buried and sort of left.
Wow. And just before we get to what you did with all this information and how you turned it into a novel, again, so you grew up in Eau Claire, was Marit, Marit, right? Marit. Was she mentioned frequently in family stories? Was she mentioned just very seldom, or just not at all?
No, nobody could talk about her, according to my mother. They were just not supposed to talk about her.
And
Um,
was she
yeah.
what was she older? Was she
Well, she would have been my great grandmother's age
okay?
she was actually younger than my great grandmother. So my mother knew her grandmother, and she would have been her great aunt. And they were told not to talk about her at all.
Do you
I
have a
do
rough
know
idea of what years she lived? A rough idea?
she was born in 1868.
Okay.
So, there's no death certificate, so I don't know when she died. I have her in the book coming to the United States in 1904. She actually came before that, but I wanted to play with a few things in the book, so I changed the date on that. But I do know, and people have said, well, maybe she died on the boat or something like that. But also had an autograph book that was given to my mother that was handed down from someone else of a man named Henry. And Mart had signed the autograph book and written Trempealeau, Wisconsin, which is a town south of Eau Claire. So I know that she was here, her trunk's here. I know that she came to the United States.
Wow. And I mean, I have so many questions, but why did you inherit the blue trunk? What was the connection? How was it designated to go to Anne Lowry?
I don't know. That's a really good question. And in fact, somebody asked me last week when I was doing a book talk, why did they even keep the trunk? If she was insane and they were so ashamed of her, why would they even keep her trunk? But for whatever reason they did. It went to my great aunt who then handed it on to my mother and she handed it on to me. So I'm not quite sure why and how I ended up with it, but I'm glad I did because I feel like I've been able to try to reclaim her life some.
Did you have the sense that anybody had opened it up and gone through it?
Yeah, it was empty. I mean, there was
Oh,
nothing in it.
oh,
Yeah. So in
oh,
the book, Rachel finds clues. The current day character finds clues in the book, but I didn't have any clues at all. So, but it was empty. It was just used kind of as decorative.
but it
Yeah.
must have been a somewhat attractive, appealing piece of luggage to keep around. It was not something you took to the dump, you know.
No, I mean it's blue and it's got beautifully calligraphied letters on it with Marit's name on it and the address that she was going to, which is interesting because in the autograph book that she signed, it's the same calligraphy writing, and it's also written in English. And also in that autograph book, there are a lot of other entries that are written in Norwegian. So I do know that, Marit spoke English, that she must have liked poetry because she wrote a poem in it. So I know a few things about her, but
Okay.
that's it. That's all I know.
Okay. All right. So we've got the trunk, we've got the source of inspiration. Tell us as a writer, and tell us a little bit about how much fiction you'd written up to that point. I know you've been writing since you were a child based on your website and what you put out there. But how did you develop and take an object and turn it into a story?
Yeah, I had been writing my whole life. I mean, I've joked with my high school friends that, we go out and then I go home and write. It was usually op-eds that I was penning about some angst I was having at the time. But I wrote, and I was an academic. I was a college professor, so I wrote nonfiction. Um, and I did get a few op-eds published over the years. And I did some ghost writing of nonfiction books, but I'd never really written any fiction before. I do have an undergraduate English major, but that does not necessarily qualify one to write fiction, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Um, but Minneapolis has a Loft Literary Center, which is, it offers many classes, and they offer a year-long intensive novel writing class. So I signed up for that, and that was how I got started. And there was a cohort of 13 of us, and we gave each other feedback. We also had a really excellent teacher. And so that's how I got going. And by the end of the year, I pretty much had a completed first draft of a novel. Then there were the 12 revisions after that, but I did have a first draft after that class. So that's how I got going writing fiction. And I had to learn a lot. I mean, I had to learn how to write scenes, I had to learn how to write dialogue, which I'm still not fabulous at. And I need to work a little bit more on that. But I think that probably my biggest strength was apparently I have quite a vivid imagination because I was able to come up with some story and plot twists and things like that. But it was very fun.
So when was the first of the 12 drafts? Well, how long ago was that?
That was 2 years ago. It pretty much
Okay.
it took me about a year to write the first draft and then a couple years to do all the revision. Well, a year and a half to do all the revisions. And then I had two editors editing it. So there were more revisions after that. And somebody asked me, when did you know your book was done? And I said, it's not done. Every time I pick it up and look at it, I'm like, oh, I wish I'd rewritten that or could I rewrite that? But it's too late now. So
Yeah. So tell us what story you wove with this inspirational starting point?
Well, I wanted to have a current day character, and I wanted to have the current day character do some healing through finding out about her ancestor. And so just like I was trying to do some healing, in my own way by writing this, and not just about Mara, but also about some of my past and my story. And so I have a current day character. Her name is Rachel, and she's married to a conservative Arizona politician. And early in the book, she finds a scarf in his briefcase, his computer bag. So, and it's not her scarf, and it's a woman's scarf. So she suspects he's having an affair. So that's sort of the beginning of Rachel's story. She needs a distraction because it's an election year and she can't bring up anything during an election year. So her mother gives her the trunk, and then she finds clues in the trunk. So she starts on the journey then to find out what happened to mar it as a way of offering a distraction to her own life. And in the process of doing that, she grows a lot as she goes through this journey of finding out what happened to Marit. So the story goes, then I have the Marit story, which goes back to the early 1900s. And so the book goes between these two time periods. And when we follow Marit, she does end up in an insane asylum. And for those of people who want to read it, just you have to hang in there through the asylum part because it's not easy to read. Things were not great in early 1900s in asylums,
Yeah.
and there were many women institutionalized that weren't really mentally ill. But then she gets out, and we watch her grow as a person too, and find some autonomy and she's very resilient. She's very courageous. And so, we journey through her story too, as we watch Rachel and see both of them grow and develop really a unique and identity of their own.
So the modern day is set in Arizona, and the 1900s is set where?
It starts in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which is where Mart actually immigrated to. And then she ends up in St. Paul. She goes to St. Paul, Minnesota. So there's a little bit of activity in St. Paul. And then where I introduce a character who actually is based on my real grandfather who did drive a streetcar in St. Paul. So that was really fun to bring him in. And then she ends up in Arizona in the end, toward the end of the book. So she kind of goes all the places that I've gone and lived.
Yeah.
Didn't have Colorado yet, but next book.
So, I mean, I think it's hard enough. I'm fascinated by dual timeline stories because I think it's hard enough to have one timeline where you have a satisfying, successful arc, beginning, middle, and end. You've got a journey, you've got the main character starting in one place and ending in another. It's, I think it's 5 times as challenging to pull that off in the same novel and do it in another timeline as well. So, was that daunting to you? Did you have in mind when you started out what those arcs would look like for Rachel and for Marit?
Well, I was probably just really naive, thinking this would be easy to do. And my loft teacher said, "Wow, you like picked a really hard thing to do," but that has never deterred me in the past. So I just went ahead and did it. And yeah, it was challenging. I used a lot of post-it notes to try to do storylines and then, make sure they connected. And a lot of the, 12 edits after the first were about making sure I had connecting points between the two and that the themes were, you could see how the two stories were connected. Rachel had some clues, but she doesn't have the whole story, obviously. So yeah, it wasn't I guess the easiest thing to do, but it was enjoyable to do, and I like a challenge. So, like I said, I used a lot of post-it notes, and I certainly had help from my first editor, who was the teacher of my class, and my class too helped a lot. My cohort helped a lot. So it's good to have a community.
Yeah. And the other thing too is to figure out how the past informs the present. So you have, because if the past is just on its own and it's separate story, then it's a separate story. But if, as Rachel, your main character, digs into Marit's life and what she learns, then that's got to inform her decisions in the current day. I think in order for a successful dual timeline novel to work, which again ups the ante.
Yeah, it does, and she did. And as Rachel is, finding out about asylums, she's finding out about what happened to women in asylums. She's finding out the treatment of women. She's going through some of that herself. And one of my reviews said I have, sharp social commentary in the book. So I used themes, social commentary, I guess you could call it. I could call it political commentary too. I used that to really try to pull together the two stories. But there's certainly a lot around women and the treatment of women and identity. But I have some really great male characters in my book too that I love. And Rachel's husband ends up being. I started writing him as sort of this, you know, toxic male person. And then I was writing him and I just really liked him. So there's an interesting twist in the book about Blake, but he ended up being, one of my favorite characters, if not my favorite character. So
That's great. Wow. And speaking of reviews, starred review from Kirkus, which is not too shabby at all.
yeah, I was so naive. I didn't even know really what that meant. I was like, oh, it's got a little blue star by it. What is that? So yeah, I'm new at this, novice, but I'm getting there. So learning a
Yeah.
lot more. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your publishing journey. What you finished after your 12th draft. Did you then decide, what were you thinking then? Were you thinking, I want to look for an agent? Were you looking for just a publisher? What was your thought process?
Yeah, I was going to look for an agent. And so I did some querying. And then I started reading a lot about the traditional publishing industry. And I'm not the most patient person at this point in my life. And I'm not like launching a writing career. So, I didn't have the stakes weren't terribly high, other than I really was compelled to get this book in print because of Marit. I had two goals. One was to see if I could finish the book, and one was to reclaim Marit's life. So I didn't have a goal of being a famous writer. So I was reading about the publishing industry and how awful it is and how predatory it can be. And so then I did a little bit of investigating of self-publishing, and I thought, oh, I could do this. But I was also simultaneously sending out manuscripts to publishers that didn't require agented submissions. And so I had a couple of publishers respond positively, and ended up with Kohler Books. They're a small publisher. There are downsides to a small publisher, but it was apparent to me that the acquisition editor had actually read the book. So he understood, kind of what I was doing with it. So I went with them. So I feel really lucky now on the other side of it. I certainly know what some of the downsides of a small publisher are. And, maybe I've been a little bit more patient, could have been a little bit more patient to wait for an agent, but I'm actually really happy I did it the way I did it. And now that I've book out, I'm getting the platform that I would have needed to get the agent in the first place. So it's kind of like, chicken or egg sort of thing. So I would not recommend my way, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend my way. I think it really depends upon what your goals are.
Yeah. Can you say the name of the publisher again? And are they a hybrid or is it straight up traditional?
They're both hybrid and traditional. It's Kohler Books,
K-O-A?
Koehler
Got it.
Books.
Okay. I just want other people who might be listening to this and say, that sounds interesting to be able to track it down. So,
Right. Yeah. And the downside is you don't get a lot of promotions. So you end up having to do promotions yourself. But I worked with Books Forward, which I would also highly recommend. They're sort of niche in that I think they work with a particular kind of book, because I've had a couple people tell me they wouldn't work with them, but they were very helpful for me. So I was pleased with how they promoted me.
and did Kohler Books put you through an editing process as well?
They did.
Yeah.
Yes. They have a complete editor that edits the book for you. They do all the layout. They do the cover design, and you basically get two choices. And one of the things that was really funny about that, and I recommend this to people who are self-publishing too, is that they wanted me to put two cover choices on Facebook. And I hadn't been, I am now more much of a Facebook user, but so people could vote on which cover they liked. And I thought, well, that sounds sort of silly. But then I did it, and it's an excellent marketing tool. Like people that I hadn't heard from in years came out of the woodwork to vote on my book covers. So, so to authors out there who are maybe self-publishing or doing your own cover, put it on Facebook, let people vote. They love it. It's a great way to promote your book. So.
Did the people who voted agree with your choice though?
They did in the end, but it was very close.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, my choice, you've seen the book probably, is more of a, goes to the historical aspect of it. The other cover looked to me more like a mystery, so it was a little bit more contemporary design and
Yeah.
um
The final book cover is really evocative because it's got the blue and it's got those two clear images from modern and past. So
yeah, we modified it a little bit. The modern wasn't as pronounced, and I wanted that to be more pronounced because people hear this story and they think the whole book is about this ancestor person, and it's actually not. There's a lot in the book about Rachel and her struggle, and I think she's a contemporary woman dealing with a lot of issues that contemporary women deal with.
yeah. So a few minutes ago you mentioned that how you approached this book pulled a lot from some of your own journey, personal journey. Can you touch on that or talk about that a little bit? And was that hard, challenging to dig into your own stuff?
I love this question because, again, naive me, I was kind of like, well, I'll just write this book and I won't have to do, so in the story, the very first, the prologue is about Rachel losing her sister. Her sister dies suddenly. That is my story. And then Rachel's relationship with her mother is also my story. And so, my story is out there in this book, and people who are really close to me sometimes had a hard time reading some of that stuff because they're like, oh, I didn't know it was so hard for you. But of course it was. But I also, one thing I was telling a group last week when I was talking about genealogy and using that as a way to sort of heal from your family history is that I have a scene in the book where Rachel and her mother go on a hike, and they're at the top of the hike. This is a Boynton Canyon in Sedona, Arizona, and it's a beautiful hike. If you've never been there, I encourage you to check it out. And she and her mother are having this conversation about her sister dying and what happened to Rachel, how she felt like she should have died. And it's the conversation I wish that I'd had with my mother, which I never had. But the other thing that was really interesting for me in writing it was because to write the dialogue of Rachel's mother, Rose, I had to put myself in Rose's shoes. And I knew cognitively how hard it must be to lose a child. I mean, I have kids. Fortunately, I didn't have they're still here. I knew cognitively, but to write the dialogue and actually really have to get into Rose's head was so healing for me because I was able to really see my mother's perspective on this. And it helped me understand some of the things that, I had going on. So the answer to the question, yes, it was really hard to put it out there. It is hard to put it out there. It's hard to talk about sometimes. That particular section is especially poignant for me, but it also was extremely healing for me. I think more healing than all the years of therapy I've had and, all the conversations I've had with people about it. So, long story short, fiction can be a very healing thing, writing fiction.
Yeah. And just ask a question about on the Marit side. So if you can think back now to when you first started this little idea in your head about the blue trunk, and at that point it was kind of a blank page. It was empty. You have now successfully filled that in. Is the fictional world that you built for her now the reality as far as you're concerned about the actual person?
Yeah, it is. It is. One of my cousins gets read the book and she's still very confused about what our family history was because she's not clear what was fiction and what was real in my book. But it is the reality, and obviously it's fiction. But I've recreated her, and if you Google her name, it will come up. It will come up under my book, but it will come up. So I'm kind of like, that gives her an identity that she never had. And it brought her back and reclaimed her. So yeah, there are times I have to stand back and go, wait, what's real and what's not real. But the bottom line is there wasn't much there. I mean, everything in the book is pretty much fiction because I couldn't find anything about her. And I've had all these genealogy experts say, well, we could help you find more. We could help you find more. But the National Archives has a comment on their website that says, most asylum documents were destroyed or are long lost, were destroyed in the 30s and 40s. So if you have a family member who was in an asylum prior to that, it's really going to be hard to find information about them. And, somebody's like, what about graves? Did you change your name? There's just like nothing. So most all of it's all fiction. But,
Yeah.
isn't life a lot of that with how we interpret it? We see it and it's our interpretation of it. So,
Yeah. Looking back from that first draft and right on through finding Kohler books and everything else, are there any lessons learned that you would pass along to others who are just starting out and working on their debut novel?
lessons learned, the biggest one is that the fun part is that first 10% of the time you spend writing the book. And then about 90% of it is editing. And you just got to slog through it and be willing to take feedback and be willing to change plot and story, be willing to cut out characters or make new characters. That is one reason why I think my academic background was really helpful. I learned really young as an academic that you're going to get beat up, you're going to get told you're wrong, you're going to have to redo things. And so I was pretty open to changes, but editing is a lot of it, edit the writing, the time you get to live in the book. That's so fun. And then you have to go to the reality of editing and really polishing it up and making it, the book that you want it to be. So that would be my one big piece of advice.
I I 1,000% uh, endorse, co-sign that point. I think that is so important and valuable. And I even think for those going the independent publishing slash self-publishing route, that you can't short circuit that editing process. It is it is endless. There is a point where you do need to declare it done and close the books and say it's over. There's always room for improvement in anything, but I think the more you invest in that rewriting and that reconsideration, the developmental editing, the copy editing, everything, the better product you're going to have. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
What is next? How you're taking this, what you've learned and applying it to another novel, I hope.
I am. I've started, although I'm really busy promoting, so it's kind of fits and starts. My my aunt was a WASP in World War II and flew all the big planes, across the country. And I wanted to bring that story back. I had this idea before Kristen Hanna wrote The Women. She wrote about Vietnam nurses, but WASPs were essential to the World War II, the movement. And so I wanted to write about her and write about the WASPs. And so that's that's what I'm working on. And I've just decided the last few days I'm probably going to have again a current day character, but this person, the WASP, but the main character will still be alive and they will have conversations. I'm not quite sure how to set that up yet. So of course, I'm going to just do something different and make it really hard again, but that's okay. I have time. So,
Yeah.
but I'm excited to start that one too. And again, it's there are 2,000 of them, 26,000 were called, 2,000 of them were selected, 1,100 made it, 38 died in service to their country. They didn't have military benefits until Carter gave them to them in the 1970s. My aunt got the Congressional Medal of Honor after she had died posthumously. So,
Wow.
it's a group of women. Fannie Flagg wrote a book about them, but other than that, there's not really been too much written about them. So,
Might check out Amy K. Runyon, who
okay.
is a very well-known Rocky Mountain fiction writers member. and has been on the podcast many times, probably 4 or 5. And she has a whole series of novels featuring strong women in both World War I and I believe World War II. And I'm not sure if she's got the WASP pilots with the folks or not, but so I just in the general category, but I think she may have, and she's a fabulous writer.
That's great. Thanks.
Amy K. Runyon, yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wrote it down. Got it.
Wow. Well, this has just been absolutely fantastic. And I know you're pretty new to Colorado, but you immediately or very soon after arriving here found Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers. So thank you for joining the community. Did you come to the conference this year?
I didn't. I had a commitment that was out of town, so I
Yeah.
couldn't go, but I will next year for sure.
Yeah.
So
It's a terrific conference.
yeah, it sounds like it.
You should put on a workshop about your process or something because you've got a great story to tell. So,
Yeah.
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 So as we wrap up, we always like to have our guests recommend a writer or a book to pass it along to our audience and inspire our audience to read or check out a title or an author you like.
hmm Well, I love Kristen Hanna, but I'm going to recommend Peter Guy. It's Geye. Peter is his first name. He's written several books. Most of them take place in northern Minnesota, often about Norwegian immigrants, similar to mine. But he's a beautiful, beautiful writer. His books are lovely, and the latest one he wrote is Ski Jumper, and it's a great book.
Oh, great. Excellent. Um, well, I think Kristen Hanna probably is doing okay.
I think
Based
so
on
too.
that. So I think that's a great choice. And before I wrap it up, this is a kind of a risky thing here live on the podcast, but I just realized you mentioned Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and right next to me.
That's awesome.
So this is a beer case. I've been using it for years. I keep 45s in here. I keep I keep music in here. There's the Ramones. So
Wow. What is the brewing company?
it's Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It's the malt
Is it
beer.
Walter's
They're,
Brewing?
they're, they're no longer it's old. They've stopped making it.
Yeah. I
And
actually didn't even know. I mean, Kugels is in Chippewa Falls and Walter's Brewing Company, but I bet that's the same part of maybe they
I
renamed.
drank this beer for years.
Wow.
I kept the cases because I just liked them. I have 3 of those filled with 45. So small world, Ann
Yeah.
Lowry, small
Yeah.
world. And
That's right.
that was not a prop. That wasn't a setup. It was just sitting right there.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, Ann, thank you so much for your time, and we will catch up with you for novel number 2.
That's great. Thank you. It was really fun to talk.